Hello and welcome to Rekt, the Michael Rectenwald podcast. This is episode 2, and in this episode I'm joined by a very special guest. Heather McDonald is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal, and a New York Times best-selling author. Heather is the author of many books, including The War on Cops, The Diversity Delusion, and her most recent book entitled When Race Trumps Merit: How the Pursuit of Equity Sacrifices Excellence, Destroys Beauty, and Threatens Lives, which will be the focus of today's discussion. She is the recipient of the 2005 Bradley Prize. Heather McDonald's work at City Journal has covered a range of topics, including higher education, immigration, policing, homelessness and homeless advocacy, criminal justice reform, and race relations. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the New Republic, and the New Criterion. I would like to also add that Heather is part of a thriving and growing email list of dissident professors and scholars, of which I am also a member. This list includes Janice Fiamengo, Philip Salzman, Pat Kambapati, Gad Sad, Jordan Peterson, and many others who have joined recently. Could this group be the beginning of what Heather calls, quote, a membership organization dedicated to the unapologetic defense of colorblind standards of achievement and behavior, which she sees as part of a solution to the problems raised by her book? More on this toward the end of this discussion, perhaps. Hello, Heather. Thanks
Hi,
so
Michael.
much for being here.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. And I'm sure it'll be the pleasure of our listeners as well. So let's jump right into a discussion of your book, When Race Trumps Merit. Can you tell us why you decided to write this book? What is it that was troubling you or drew your attention to this issue?
Every day I see more attacks on the idea of excellence, on the idea of achievement, on the idea of colorblind expertise. And I see the things that I love, whether it's the music of Schubert and Chopin and Bach and Brahms, or the art of Tiepolo and Rembrandt and Velázquez, being accused in an absolutely preposterous fashion of systemic racism. The things that we take for granted in Western civilization, whether it's due process of law, colorblind justice, the accomplishment of extraordinary scientific success, the liberation from squalor and poverty, all of these things are now under daily assault by the phony narrative that America and Western civilization itself is systemically racist, and I can't take it any longer. I'm not going to be silenced by completely spurious charges of racism, and I'm going to speak the truth about why there are ongoing racial disparities in America.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that, first of all, I'd just like to say the book is an excellent exposition and example of amazingly astute argumentation that should put most academic scholars to utter shame because of the way that it masters material and treats the evidence, which I think is extremely even-handed, but it's also very, very poignant in terms of its argumentation.
Thank you.
So let's jump into some of the concepts. I think the key concept in the book is this notion of disparate impact and disparate impact analysis. So tell us what these terms mean and how have they impacted society in general?
Disparate impact refers to the notion that if a colorblind, constitutional, meritocratic standard results in fewer blacks, say, being admitted to an institution, that standard is per se racist. Let me give you some examples, Michael. We've had for decades now litigation against police departments and fire departments because their minimal entrance exams, cognitive entrance exams, resulted in more blacks failing those exams. So if a firefighting department in Boston or New York City or Los Angeles had a test for 8th grade reading levels in order to make sure that firefighters could read the chemical instructions of using a firefighting chemical, or that police officers could understand the patrol guide to know when it was lawful to make a pedestrian stop or when it was lawful to search somebody's trunk. If blacks failed an 8th grade reading test at higher rates, the courts decided that, well, we have to throw out the test. Even though the test is colorblind, neutral, not implemented with any kind of discriminatory intent, but merely to try and establish a basic floor of competence in order to accomplish a particular job. Now, every single meritocratic standard, almost by definition, is going to have a disparate impact on blacks, not because those standards are racist, but because of something that it is taboo to talk about, and which I break that taboo in the book, which is the massive academic skills gap. The reality is this: you can have meritocracy or you can have diversity. You cannot have both because of the skills gap. And let's give the numbers in a few moments. But disparate impact holds that if a medical school uses a colorblind objective computer-graded test, i.e. the medical college admissions test, the MCATs, to select students, and blacks score much more poorly on that test, well, it's time to reconsider the test. It's not time to say, how about you meet the standards? Instead, we're throwing out the standards. Let me give your viewers, Michael, a sense of what I'm talking about with this academic skills gap, because most Americans have been kept in the dark. We're about to have the Supreme Court, I hope, declare racial preferences illegitimate. And the discourse in the New York Times will be simply that somehow, without racial preferences, blacks won't get admitted to college in satisfying enough numbers at Harvard or Yale, without ever explaining why that is. Well, here's why it is. When you look at all black 12th graders in the United States, 66% of them do not possess even partial mastery of basic 12th grade math skills, such as doing arithmetic or reading a graph. 8% are proficient in 12th grade math, and the number that is of black 12th grade maths who are advanced in 12th grade math is too small to show up statistically. Reading is not much better. 50% of black 12th graders do not possess even partial mastery of the most basic 12th grade reading skills. Those gaps never close. They continue throughout college. They continue into graduate school. And again, they mean that you can either have meritocracy or you can have diversity. Any institution that announces that it is pursuing diversity has just told you that it has instituted massive racial preferences and a double standard of competence and admissions.
Absolutely. So, you treat the question of the problem of medical training and admissions to colleges and medical schools in particular. And you talk about some of the dangers this poses. I mean, I call the gravest danger death by diversity. That is, yes, we might end up dead at the hands of unqualified doctors, engineers, or other professionals, so-called professionals. So what is going on in medical school admissions and with racial quotas and the disparate impact imperative and the content in medical science?
It's extraordinary, Michael. Sort of mediocre test scores on the MCATs that would be virtually automatically disqualifying if presented by a white or Asian college student applying to medical school are virtually automatically a grounds for admission if you're black or Hispanic, but especially black. Blacks have 9 times higher chances of getting admitted with below average scores than Asians, and a 7 times higher chance of getting admitted with those scores than whites. And let's just point out here, in advance of the renewal of the pro-preference ideology that's come out of the courts in the case going up to the Supreme Court, challenging the Harvard racial preferences and the University of North Carolina racial preferences, the district court in Boston that affirmed the Harvard racial preferences actually said that racial preferences are not zero-sum, that you can have massive racial preferences that basically are forcing Asians to squeeze through an ever smaller hole of admission without disqualifying Asians, without meaning that for every preference admit, the reality is that's one less person who's actually qualified that will get in. But the courts, Allison Burroughs, district court judge in Boston, denied that reality. That is the reality. And so what happens with all racial preference programs, or indeed with any type of admissions preferences, Michael, is you're setting up the alleged beneficiaries to struggle, if not outright fail. When you admit students to an academic environment for which they're not competitively qualified, they will not keep up because the teaching is quite legitimately pitched towards the average of the class, people that were not admitted through preferences. And so what we see with blacks in undergraduate education, and this has been rigorously documented, it turns out, ironically, in one study of Duke University by Peter Arcidicchiano, who's the expert witness in the plaintiffs in the Harvard case, black incoming freshmen at Duke University, black male incoming freshmen, actually intend to major in a STEM field at higher rates than whites. But by the time you get to senior year, there are very few black students that are actually graduating in a STEM field. Why? Because they have been admitted to Duke with a standard deviation below those of their peers when it comes to SATs. And so they don't keep up. It's really not their fault. It's the fault of the admissions officers who admitted students knowingly. I mean, if they don't know this, they are absolute idiots and they have their heads in the sand, knowing that they're setting those students up to struggle. Had the black students that had been catapulted into Duke instead gone to a North Carolina State University where they were competitively qualified, they would have likely graduated with a STEM degree. So what happens in medical schools? The exact same thing. Black students are brought in with much lower academic skills than their white and Asian peers. They end up at the bottom of their class. They do very poorly in the first step of the medical licensing exam, something called Step 1, which tests after a student's second year the student's basic knowledge of anatomy, physiology, drug pharmacology, how to read X-rays and CAT scans and how the body functions. And so what we do, rather than saying, well, maybe we should rethink racial preferences, or maybe, students in high school and college should study more and get better skills. No, we can't do either of those things. So we've now gone from a graded basis for the Step 1 of the medical licensing exam to pass-fail, to cover up the fact that blacks are at the bottom of their class. And so now when hospital residencies are choosing residents, they won't know other than a very broad distinction between pass and fail, who are the most qualified students. And the pressure is going to go on to Step 2 of the medical licensing exam. You have now medical honor societies, Alpha, Omega, Alpha, that have changed the criteria for ownership, no longer academic exclusively, but so-called soft skills, doing community service or whatnot. Everywhere you look in medicine today, standards are being watered down because they all have a disparate impact on blacks.
Incredible. And they keep pushing the testing and other evaluations of achievement. It seems that the elites keep pushing this achievement gap further up the chain, from grade school to high school to college admissions to college advancement to law and medical school admissions to advancement through those fields and finally into those professions.
Yep.
I mean, don't these elites see, that in pushing this hot potato up the line, this is possibly being done at their own peril and at the peril of their children and grandchildren? Or is this like the immigration policy where the elites promote unfettered immigration, which affects the majority, but probably not them? I mean, what are they thinking?
Well, you don't know what emergency room you're going to be taken to if you're in a car crash, and you can't choose your doctor there. So at some point, you would think that they would realize that this may affect them, or you don't know the engineer, who's been brought in on a racial preference program working on your apartment building. It's stunning to me. And you come out of an academic environment more recently than I, Michael, and so you're closer to these people. I can't begin to explain it, but I will say that it's completely nihilistic. It comes down to denying that there is any difference in skills and any way of measuring a difference in skills, both of which are phony propositions. There are people that are massively gifted in math and science, or in music, or in art, and others that are not. And there are ways that we can test those skill levels. We simply can. Knowledge is real. Science is real. Science is not racist. Standards are not racist. And yet our absolute mass psychosis about the fact that blacks are still lagging behind is so great that we are willing to throw out what is true and what is commonsensical about the fact of human skill differences and the fact that we have achieved breakthroughs in human existence, in being able to live healthy, warm, electrically empowered, amazing electricity, amazing clean water. These things, amazing vaccines, amazing medicines, all of these things we take for granted that were built upon people with superior skills that saw into the secrets of the universe in a way that none of us mediocrities will ever be able to do, and yet now we're all denying that there was any genius involved in these things.
And what's happening to these students who are looking at these fields, seeing how the deck is stacked against them, these talented people who look at the medical profession and see that it's stacked against them, that look at science fields and other, STEM fields in general, and see that the deck is stacked against them if they're white, or if they happen to be white males, in which case the deck is doubly stacked against them. What are they going to do? They say they're not, well, I'll do something else, but eventually everything is going to be foreclosed. So what happens to these people?
It's a total pincer movement. It is a culling of whites and white males in particular, and Asians, of course, too. There's fewer proportionally, but they are having to meet higher and higher standards to be considered at all. I don't know where they're eventually going to go. I know many white males, and I've been told of many white males who absolutely understand what's happening. They're not going to medical school. They're not going to STEM because they understand they are going to be the last people considered, the first people fired, but they're going to have to meet much, much higher standards than the preferred groups of females, blacks and Hispanics. And we are, without question, putting in jeopardy future scientific progress because we are not selecting our best scientists. We are selecting our most diverse scientists. And sometimes those are equal. Those are completely overlapping Venn diagrams, or there is an overlap. And so by choosing the most diverse scientist, you actually get the best. But on average, that is impossible. Given, again, the size of these skills gaps, it is impossible. And yet medical school after medical school in the last couple of years has been putting Blacks in charge. And these are not just figurehead positions. It matters. This is true also in who's leading cancer research labs or Alzheimer's research labs. It matters who is in that position because they are setting research agendas. They have to be able to understand what is going on in a field. Joe Biden put to head the Department of Energy's Office of Science a Black female Ethiopian who was a soil geologist, whose main specialty when she was at the University of California at Merced was being a diversity and equity sort of consultant type and writing on sexism in soil geology. This is absurd. And let me just clarify, because this is not the Rick Perry position. People can say, well, what did Rick Perry know about energy besides being, coming out of Texas and the oil and gas field? This is an office within the Department of Energy that is exclusively science-based, that is the largest federally funded science agency that works at the cutting edge of nuclear weaponry, nuclear energy, high stakes physics. And who do we have there? We have a Black female soil geologist chosen because she was a Black and female. This means we are not going to be getting our wisest decision making out of what is an extraordinarily crucial funder and participant in basic atomic research.
I mean, that's extremely, very, very, very concerning. I mean, I saw this in less important fields in a way. I was on a hiring committee I was the chair of the committee charged to hire a writing and journalism professor. And we had amazing candidates. This is NYU, so we're looking at 450 some candidates, many of them extremely qualified. And I remember the utter setting aside, and not on my part, but on the other committee members, setting aside all white males, first of all. Then they pushed through, and I objected, they pushed through this one woman who couldn't write a sentence in her letter to the committee for the job. In her emails to me in correspondence, could not write a sentence. The most botched prose I would have expected from a first-year student in their first email exchange with me. In fact, worse. And yet they pushed this candidate through, and in fact, I got thrown off the committee because I objected, and they hired her. And she put up on the website shortly thereafter the most important things about the most important elements of teaching is. She even on her personal faculty profile page, committed all these grammatical errors, and I was called a racist. This is why I know I'm not close to any of these people in academia anymore. I was called a racist and everything else, because I insisted on quality and not identity. So identity is the criteria here, and it's being foisted on us through every field. Now, let me turn now a little bit to the arts, culture and the arts. You're a real aficionado and quite well-versed in what we might call high European-based culture and arts, which is your want and your prerogative. And you do an excellent job in explicating a lot of that, exposing what's going on there. But you say in your treatment of culture and the arts, you make it clear that only Western cultural products, producers, performances, curation, et cetera, are being subjected to the kind of deconstruction that they are on the basis of so-called past sins like colonialism, exploitation, racism, et cetera. Can you elaborate on this and tell us, what does this say about this anti-racism campaign? Is it essentially anti-whiteness at base?
Yes, absolutely. It is anti-white. Let's just say it. That is what is going on.
Yeah.
But what is also going on is Western civilization is committing suicide.
Hmm.
It has decided to efface itself, and that you refer to immigration. I mean, we're doing that with importing massive numbers of low-skilled, less cognitively advanced third world immigrants. We're doing it with trans, which is trying to
Yeah.
sterilize as many young people as possible. And we're doing it at the highest levels of our civilization as well by subjecting Western civilization and only Western civilization to the deconstructive acid of, this painting by Rembrandt is merely a prop for Dutch colonialism in Antigua or whatever. It's just, and the double standards in this case are amazing in the opposite direction. At the same time that the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam are impugning their superb collections of Golden Age Dutch Baroque art for phantom racism, they're elevating African art or Chinese art for their artistic grandeur without ever asking, was this African warrior bronze made by to honor a African chief who is engaged in massive tribal genocide or who has participated in the transatlantic slave trade? Where we criticize our artistic traditions for their demographic history, the inevitable reality that something coming out of Europe, a artistic tradition, whether it's classical music or painting, ballet, is going to be white because that's what the demographics of that continent were. We do not go to Chinese classical opera and say, well, you must be exclusionary, you must be oppressing the other, because the traditional participants in Chinese classical opera, and to this day, are all Chinese. We don't complain that African drum language, the Yoruba talking drum, is racist, anti-white, or anti-Asian because all the drummers are black. It is a double standard that usually we think of double standards as benefiting the person wielding them. Only the West employs double standards against itself. It skewers itself with a set of standards that it completely holds the rest of the world harmless from. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, this is based on like a cartoon version of history in which only white Europeans, in particular white European men,
Yeah.
have done all the evil that has ever happened on the planet. And of course, this is just pure caricature of reality. It's the most ahistorical, utterly, politically and historically myopic and ridiculous notion.
Yeah.
And this is driving the whole regime. Let's turn a little bit. Some of our viewers may be more versed in popular culture, which you don't necessarily treat, but we could talk about it anyway, because some of the same kind of anti-racist, or dare I say anti-whiteness agenda is also prevalent in mass or pop culture. For example, you can't watch television today without seeing that most of the commercials now feature mostly blacks and our other minorities, and that whites are vastly underrepresented. And when whites are represented, I dare say, and I will, they're often represented in interracial couples where the woman is white. I mean, what's going on here?
Well, I'll have to say, if I have to throw some sop to the diversity hyenas, I'll throw commercials. It's absolutely true. I mean, people have been noticing that. If that would buy us time or keep the hyenas at bay, I'll take it, because as far as I'm concerned, I don't really care about Citibank's commercials or Vanguard or whatnot, but it's the same instinct for sure. What concerns me more is the teaching young people, if they even come within 100 yards of our greatest fine arts traditions, or even American, you talk about popular music, I mean, the American Songbook, one of the great American contributions to world music is is the songbook and the big band tradition. Those are overwhelmingly white composers. We're teaching young people to reject these great traditions, including the Western classical tradition of, Pretorius and Gabrieli through Bach and Rachmaninoff, simply on the absolutely stupid, nonsensical, meaningless, and illegitimate ground of race and sex. And so young people are already just preposterously ignorant of the legacy of Western civilization, but now they have a certified, adult-approved excuse for perpetuating that ignorance, which is, well, why should I even try to listen to a Beethoven symphony, because he's just a dead white male, and the only reason anybody has ever thought that Beethoven was one of the titans of human genius was because he was a white male. So that's what breaks my heart.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if I cared about movies based on cartoons that were successful, I would at least be sort of bitterly laughing at all those remakes. And at this point, we still have two powers. We have the power of the ballot. We don't have to vote for diversity candidates. And yes, I do believe that we still do have the power of the ballot. You may have viewers that think, oh no, everything is rigged, but I don't think that's quite the case yet. But we also have the power of the purse. We don't have to buy the Hollywood remakes that are uber diverse conscious, and the superheroes being replaced by American Indian transvestites or something. You don't have to buy it for now. Like, let's be very organized with our consumer boycotts, because I actually am so pessimistic and cynical that I believe that eventually somebody's going to come up with a way to force people to buy woke products, so you'll have to buy your Bud Light. There'll be taxes removed from your bank account or something so that you can buy the latest product that's been promoted by the latest top dog victim on the great totem pole of victimhood.
Yeah, I think I think you're right. We still have consumer power, but the way this is going is that they're going to try to eliminate from the market those non-compliant producers, those non-compliant companies, those non-compliant individuals. And they're doing this, and it seems to be part of a larger agenda that includes resetting the economy vis-a-vis ESG indexing and the stock market, the rise of this so-called stakeholder capitalism, globalism, immigration, the trans agenda. So it seems to be a big agenda, and this, the racial element is a big part of it. So it seems it couldn't be completely driven by elite white guilt. Or is it? I mean, what other explanation is there for what's driving all this? Is the elite somehow a beneficiary of this anti-racism regime, or what would you say to that?
Well, they're the beneficiary in terms of self-congratulatory virtue points. They certainly feel like they are superior to their American peers out in the red state hinterlands. As far as whether they are financially benefiting from it, I'm not sure. I think I tend to err on the side of believing in ideological and cultural explanations rather than economic ones. But I know there's been some interesting work done by, say, a professor at Williams College, Darrell Paul, about corporate involvement in the whole embracing the gay movement. And there's a critique that corporations, for them, the ideal consumers are, say, gay white males, because they have a lot of additional spending power, since by and large they're not in the same family structures. And I'm not encouraging that, because I think that children need their biological mothers and fathers. But in any case, there are efforts to link an economic motive to some of this wokeness. I think that the big issue for me in the culture, I mean, I'm now just starting to write about the trans issue for the first time, and it is truly the most bizarre thing that has happened in all millennia of human history. It is just impossible to understand. That having been said, and as I say, I think it is motivated by this self-suicide impulse that the West has, which it wants to simply obliterate itself. And so we are trying to make as many young people infertile as possible. Nevertheless, I do think for me, the big theme of our world today is racial disparities, our response to those disparities, because the threat to meritocratic standards that keep us all alive and away from death by diversity is the tearing down of standards to avoid disparate impact.
Okay, yeah. Your chapter, I mean, one last question on culture. Your chapter on Juilliard reminds me of Ralph Ellison and his argument with Irving Howe. Howe had written, I think it was in Dissent in 1963, that that Ellison's Invisible Man wasn't angry enough, that in effect Howe wasn't writing like a black man should, and that his character should have been more enraged, like the character Bigger Thomas in Richard Wright's novel Native Son. Howe's essay was called Black Boys and Native Sons, pejoratively enough, and Ellison retorted with an essay called The World and the Jug, where he suggested that Howe was attempting to relegate him, Ellison, to a corked jug from which he could see other cultures but was not allowed to know, experience, or participate in them based on his skin color. He said it was a kind of cultural containment worse than the Jim Crow South, and it seems to me that all these prohibitions based on so-called cultural appropriation are doing the same thing, not only to whites, but to blacks as well. And that in the case of Juilliard, blacks are doing this to themselves as well as to whites.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I mean, cultural appropriation is just about the stupidest idea out there is, because culture is appropriation. The idea that you can have boundaries around different cultural expressions and civilizations is absurd. And then who do we get permission from? You know, if I Whistler am going to be able to use Japanese prints to inspire my compositions, who do I go to be certified that I'm allowed to appropriate Japanese woodblock printmaking? I mean, this is absurd. And how many votes of approval do I need? The whole thing is just amazing, but it is another hustle. It is another race hustle. Here's the thing, Michael. The mob cannot create. It can tear down. Mm-hmm. It can put up barbed wire. It can say, you may not do this. We're going to tear this down. We hate this. We can't create, but we can sure destroy. And that's what they're doing. They're saying, you cannot create. We're not going to allow you to create. We're setting the rules. Yes, I mean, these black students that are going around claiming that they're oppressed by hearing an auditory recreation of the African slave trade that came out of the TV series in the 70s of Roots, they should be grateful. You know, in one sense, they should be grateful that Juilliard wants to teach all of its drama students about an actual sort of visceral experience of what it was to be enslaved. And instead, black students have to come up at Juilliard, have to come up with a new way to be oppressed. And now they're oppressed because they have to listen to this. And how dare Juilliard appropriate their history? Well, how are we supposed to do history? Excuse me. This was an insane moment. It continues. The black students are dictating that you have to have 50% of the drama curriculum has to be BIPOC authors, the POCs and the BI and whatnot, which is simply not realistic given the Western theatrical tradition, because African theater, to the extent it exists, it's all ritual. There are no written plays to perform. And they're saying we shouldn't have to learn standard American dialect. That's oppressive. We should have our disciplinary records wiped clean, but not those of whites. They are limited. Yes, they are limiting themselves. But of course, what they really want to do is limit their fellow white students and white playwrights and white actors from getting jobs. And I know a lot of theater directors in regional theaters that are just getting out of the profession, because the theater profession is the worst in the arts. It is worse than classical music. It is, hard as this is to believe, it is worse than art museums. Theater has gone utterly berserk. And there was an interesting sign of how this is shaking out in Los Angeles. There's been traditionally a whole arts complex in downtown LA that used to be called the Music Center. I don't know if it still is. I went to the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion as a child every Sunday, to the LA Philharmonic, to the matinee performances. I'm very grateful that my father took me to those. But there's a theater in that complex called the Mark Taper Forum that has been very groundbreaking. It's premiered a number of plays that went on over the last half century or more, that went on to be national and international successes. Well, it has gone very big into woke. I think all of its plays that it mounted in the last year or so were by the usual diverse crew of authors. And it's just announced a so-called pause because the audience numbers are so low. And we may see this on Broadway as well. So there's still, as I say, the box office alternative or power of the purse. And we'll see how many companies go out of business because they have decided that they're all white bashing all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So they want us locked in a kind of identity chrysalis, from which we can't escape and can't understand each other, and cannot possibly appropriate each other's knowledge or artistic expression or anything. So, yeah, and I think it is self-serving. They're looking to basically dominate everything and drive people out of the field, using identity as the lever.
Right.
Now, let's turn to crime, since you spend a third of your book on that, roughly. And I lived in New York City for 11 years when I taught at NYU. I left in January 2019, and according to your book, apparently just in the nick of time to avoid the swelling crime wave that has since engulfed that city. Can you tell us what's happened to New York and since the Summer of Love in terms of crime and law enforcement?
Well, I want to expand the scope. It's not just New York, it's the country. Okay. Everything that you see today in the criminal justice system is explained by race and disparate impact. It is the reason why Alvin Bragg in New York City is not prosecuting whole classes of crime, whether it's trespass or theft, shoplifting, resisting arrest. George Gascon in Los Angeles is also not prosecuting a whole class of crimes. These progressive prosecutors, Kim Fox in Chicago, it's the same story everywhere. Larry Krasner in Philadelphia. It's all because of disparate impact. If your viewers are sort of scratching their heads of what's going on, why aren't we enforcing the law? It is all because of disparate impact. And conservatives can say all they want. Oh, we need to start enforcing the law. Unless we take on the race aspect, we're not going to do it. We need to be able to say that just because law enforcement has a disparate impact on black criminals, that doesn't mean it's racist law enforcement. It means that the police are going to where crime is happening, and that is overwhelmingly in black neighborhoods, overwhelmingly black on black. Blacks are gunning each other down on a daily basis at astronomical rates. There's dozens of blacks every day who are killed in homicide. That's more than all white and Hispanic homicide victims combined, even though blacks are only 13% of the population. These drive-by shootings are utterly barbaric. They're taking black children in their front yards, backyards, beds, birthday parties, parents' cars, public parks. If white kids were getting gunned down in these drive-by shootings, there'd be a revolution. So New York is actually not the worst. Neither is Chicago the worst. As far as crime, St. Louis is the worst. Memphis is the worst. Jackson, Mississippi is the worst. But we all look at Chicago mostly because it has the highest absolute numbers of homicide, and it's a world-class city, and we look at New York. But New York is bad enough. I mean, it's very squalid, it's ugly, it's dirty now, and there are just outrageous subway crime going on because we believe that mentally ill chemical abusers should be left on the street to tyrannize everybody else. And you have massive looting. You can't now go to a drugstore and buy toothpaste because everything is under lock and key. You need to wait 5 minutes for a clerk to come, if at all, to open the toothpaste section for you because we would rather lock up toothpaste than the thieves who steal it.
Yes, and you have a chapter in your book called The Road to Anarchy, which deals with the rise of crime thanks to this disparate income imperative. But have we also seen a rise in what Sam Francis famously called anarcho-tyranny? That is, a system of government that fails to enforce laws or adjudicate the protection of its citizens while simultaneously persecuting innocent people. Does this double standard you referred to not in your next chapter not also include a kind of anarcho-tyranny, a kind of policing and punishment of whites for the crime of being white, while allowing black crime, actual crime, to ravage and terrorize communities, especially their own?
Yes, I call it the great inversion, where you have government now across the board, whether it's in New York or California or nationally, putting the interests of the dysfunctional, the law-breaking, the antisocial ahead of those people who are playing by the rules, who are deferring gratification, who are obeying the law, who are working and paying taxes. We're treated as an ATM for services that are exclusively, allegedly, in the name of people that are dysfunctional. Above all, vagrants. We're supposed to tolerate the colonization of public space, the open use of drugs, urination, defecation on public spaces, and these feckless homeless outreach workers that have no capacity to change anything because they give the vagrants inevitably the option of staying on the streets, which they choose to do because they can continue using drugs there and get pizzas delivered to their box or their encampment by more outreach workers. And the law-abiding are all supposed to just look away, step over the hypodermic needles, and keep paying their taxes to pay for this thing. It's very weird. We have lost our confidence in bourgeois values of normalcy, of respect for authority, of hard work. To talk about those, to valorize those, is seen as being racist and oppressive. And we were relativistic, or I actually don't think relativism is the real problem with the left, because they are assiduously moralistic, but just about a different set of values. But we're not supposed to apply the standards that the law-abiding live by to those who have decided to live outside the social order.
I just want to make a point that in your chapter on double standards, you suggest that the term systemic racism was coined to describe the supposed racism that subsists in the absence of verifiable racists. Systemic racism is the charge of so-called anti-racists when they can't find any actual racist to blame for anything. That is, it seems to me, which is the basis, I think, of critical race theory. Racism is like a ghost in the machine, that the machine doesn't even have to be operated by whites to be racist, or so they say. I just want to throw that out there and see if you had any comment on that.
Yes, well, I couldn't have said it better myself. That is the case. I mean, we were a racist society. We were a white supremacist society. We were an apartheid society. We treated blacks with gratuitous cruelty and contempt, and it was heartbreaking. And we went around bragging to the world about how much we believed in equality when it was all a fraud. I mean, it was just astounding for us now to look back on that and not see it. But of course, we can't impose our current worldview on the past, and at the same time, America still was accomplishing great things. But I do struggle myself all the time with how much any statement of American history that doesn't talk about race needs a footnote. And so there are actually, believe it or not, things that I agree with the 1619 Project about our past. Mm-hmm. But I take very strong exception to what it says about our present. We are not today a racist society. We are the opposite. The reality today is not white privilege, it's black privilege.
Yeah.
You try and find me a single university that is not discriminating against whites in admissions and faculty hiring and promotion and preferring, whenever they can find them, blacks. It is the universal norm. That is true as well in virtually every mainstream institution, whether corporations or foundations or the media or law firms or banks, everywhere. That is the norm everywhere. So systemic racism is the term we get when we can't find actual instances of discrimination. Now, of course, the left will never admit to the so-called reverse discrimination. They actually, every so often you still hear that hilarious line that to be black, and you have to be 3 times as good today to be black if you want to get considered for a job. It was crazy when they coined the term. It's even more crazy today. Yeah, sorry, guys. No, that's not the case. You're living in an absolute fantasy bubble. You're deluding yourself if you really think that. So yeah, systemic racism is just our name for the fact that we don't have it anymore.
Yes, it's absolutely. You mentioned the George Floyd case, of course, which was the impetus to the turbocharging of this whole anti-racism disparate outcome analysis regime. And so let's talk just a minute, and then we'll move to our last question. Let's talk just a minute about this case of Derek Chauvin, the police officer convicted on 2 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter in the death of George Floyd. Whatever one thinks about the verdict, I would say one nevertheless can see in the convictions a case of sacrifice, such that the violence done to the defendant has the direct effect of precluding additional violence in the broader society. In fact, given the calls for violence by state officials in the case of any acquittal, and given the widespread violence in response to Floyd's death, could any other verdict have been expected or accepted? Even if Chauvin had been innocent of murder and manslaughter, anything short of his conviction on all counts likely would have sparked widespread violence. Even Chauvin's conviction, even with his conviction, BLM activists continued to agitate and threaten violence. Regardless of whether he was guilty, was Chauvin a scapegoat, sacrificed to the god of anti-racism?
Yes, he was. And it's very worrisome we have lots of signs, this is not the only one, of the breakdown of expectation of due process of law. I would say it's the same thing with regards to charges of sexual assault and the tyranny of the Me Too movement. But there's something called, the late Fred Siegel called riot ideology, which is basically that when blacks are angry, they have a right to riot. And that threat of riots hangs over now any trial in which a white officer is accused of mistreating or killing a black person, even though police officers are 400 times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black is to be killed by a police officer. So the threat in policing runs the opposite from what we've been led to believe. It's blacks who are a threat to the police and not vice versa. At this point, if you're a white police officer facing trial, it is a very, very scary position to be in, because any jury knows that if it doesn't bring in a conviction, that city will likely go up in smoke.
Yes, so you have to be convicted almost a priori, otherwise all hell breaks loose.
Right.
So the last question I have here is that, turning to the conclusion of your book, I mentioned your suggestion for a membership organization dedicated to the unapologetic defense of colorblind standards of achievement and behavior. Can you tell us what you mean by that, and what other solutions you propose for turning back the tide of this disparate impact regime?
Well, the hard solution, but the one that would work, is for people to stop being scared of being called racist and not let that cow them, so that when doctors are working in their field, or oncologists are getting grants and they're being told that cancer research is racist, if they weren't cowards or scared to lose their job, they would stand up and say, this is not a racist activity, and we are not discriminating against anybody in our cancer research lab on the basis of any irrelevant criterion. We want the best scientists we can get. Instead, doctors, engineers, physicists, they all have their heads down. They're terrified that if they speak out in defense of colorblind standards of achievement, they will be called racist, possibly lose their jobs. I'm sympathetic up to a point. Up to a point. At some point, people are going to have to stand up to this. So my proposal is that when you have somebody who did step up to the plate and tell the truth, such as Norman Wang, a cardiologist at the University of Pittsburgh, who has been turned into an absolute pariah, taken off this fellowship. He was the director of a fellowship program there, reviled across the board by the American Heart Association, his colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh, his colleagues elsewhere, because he wrote an article criticizing racial preferences in medical school and saying this is dangerous and not good for the beneficiaries. He's now absolutely canceled. What we need is an organization that will step up and give the real explanation for racial disparities, which is the academic skills gap in the case of meritocratic institutions and the crime commission gap in the case of the criminal justice system, that will have the facts at its fingertips, so that anytime there's one of these sacrificial auto-da-fés, there will be a group that is unaffiliated that will get out and try to get the facts out. Because right now, the only allowable explanation for racial disparities is racism. You cannot talk about academic skills gap or crime offending gaps. And as long as the only allowable explanation for racial disparities is racism, it is all coming down. And so my book tries to get out the real alternative explanation, but we need other institutions and other individuals doing that.
Yeah, I guess that begs one more question, if you'll bear with me a few more minutes here, and that is just what does account for these gaps? The skills gap, the education gap, the the learning gap, the crime gap. I mean, I know, I've heard you interviewed elsewhere, Glenn Lowry and other places, and I know, of course, you're not holding to some genetic deterministic explanation for these things. So what is your explanation for why are these gaps there?
You know that I'm not what? I'm not beholden to it, did you say?
You're not a genetic determinist who's holding to some sort of genetic deterministic explanation for skills gaps and.
Well, I would say that I would not rule out research in that. I mean, the very fact that the left is trying to cancel all research into heritability, to me, is signs of bad faith. They're worried about something there. So I would proceed full speed ahead with that type of research and see what we learn. I'm not committed to it, but I'm also not going to rule it out of hand. But right now, what we see are very large behavioral gaps, very large cultural gaps. Anybody who's been to an inner city classroom can see that that is not a group of students whose parents are bearing down on them to do their homework, to succeed, to bring home A's. It is not, you have an anti-acting white culture that stigmatizes and penalizes academic effort. The truancy rate for blacks is extremely high. The amount of homework they do is very low. The attention in school, we're another disparate impact target is school discipline, because blacks are disciplined in class in school at much higher rates, and we're only allowed to say that must be teacher racism. We're not allowed to say no, they're actually misbehaving at higher rates. That is the fact. They are. Talk to honest inner city teachers and let them tell you about what the type of insubordination is like that they're seeing. So as long as you have a culture that doesn't put a high priority on academic achievement, you're going to get these achievement gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we don't know about genetics, but we can certainly point to cultural factors that are obvious and clear to anybody that's honest. And I think that's where we'll leave it. And it's been a great pleasure and a learning experience talking to you, Heather. And you're a fount of knowledge on these matters in terms of statistics and just a knowledge base that can't be assailed, I think. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it.